Welcome to International Management, the podcast that breaks down the core challenges and strategies of global business. Based on Orlando Casaubon's scripts for his international management class, each episode offers practical insights, clear strategies, real-world examples, and expert guidance to help you navigate complex global landscapes. For additional resources, visit casaubon.com. Now, let's dive into the essentials of international management.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into something super relevant today, international management, but with a focus on ethics and sustainability and how huge a role they play for companies operating globally.
Yeah, it's not just about profits anymore. It's about making a real positive impact. And you've all been exploring the world of international business. So now it's time to see how companies can actually operate responsibly on that global scale.
Exactly. So many of you are probably prepping for big meetings, writing papers, or maybe you're just curious. Either way, get ready for some fascinating stuff. We're going to unpack case studies, see how companies approach this whole social responsibility thing, and even uncover how different cultures can impact ethical decisions across borders. Should be a fun ride.
One of the things that I find most fascinating is how social responsibility is becoming like a core value for a lot of leading businesses. They're realizing that doing good is actually good for the bottom line, too.
It's definitely not just about following the law anymore. It's evolved into something way bigger, right?
You're right. Social responsibility has gone from like a fringe idea to a core concern, especially over the last few decades. I mean, this shift really gained traction during the 60s and 70s with the rise of, the environmental and civil rights movements. Companies started realizing they couldn't just ignore their impact on the world.
Yeah, it makes you realize how much has changed even in the past 50 years. And speaking of change, let's talk about sustainability. Not just a local issue anymore, is it?
Definitely not. We live in a globalized world, and environmental issues, they don't stop at borders. It's interesting how environmental laws are key to keeping companies in check. The challenge is that enforcing these laws can be totally different from one country to the next.
That's true. Creates an interesting dynamic for sure. And you see some companies really taking the initiative with green technologies, reducing waste, and even switching to renewable energy sources.
Exactly. They're embracing this concept called the triple bottom line. It's not just about profits, it's about considering their social and environmental impact as well.
Finding that sweet spot where people, planet, and profit all align. Love that. So how do companies actually contribute to the well-being of society through their actions? I'm thinking things like philanthropy and charitable giving, right?
That's definitely part of it. We see companies making donations, supporting the arts, and even funding public health and education initiatives. But it goes beyond that, too. Some companies are taking a stand on political and social issues, which, can be a bit of a minefield to navigate.
Especially in countries where social injustices are really prevalent, right?
Yeah.
That adds another layer of complexity.
For sure. And that's where we see these hot spots of social responsibility, where companies face a ton of scrutiny, particularly regarding their labor practices, how transparent their supply chain is, and their environmental impact.
And that's where the benefits of really embracing corporate social responsibility, or CSR, become clear. Things like easier access to capital, a stronger brand reputation, and being able to attract top talent who share the company's values.
Not to mention potential cost savings and reduced risks that come with sustainable practices. There are some really good reasons for companies to prioritize CSR.
It seems like a win-win for everyone involved. Managing this across borders, though, that can't be easy, can it? Think about all the different cultures and expectations a global company has to navigate.
You're hitting the nail on the head there. When it comes to managing social responsibility internationally, companies tend to take one of four approaches. The first one is what we call the obstructive stance. They basically try to avoid any responsibility.
So just staying under the radar.
Exactly.
Right.
Then there's the defensive stance, where they do the absolute minimum required by law. Then we have the accommodative stance. These companies go a step further, exceeding those legal requirements and often responding to concerns from stakeholders.
And finally, there's the proactive stance, where CSR is like part of their DNA.
Exactly. It's woven into the fabric of their business. And speaking of proactive companies, our research mentions Deutsche Bahn and their DB 2020 sustainability strategy as a prime example.
Oh yeah, Deutsche Bahn, they're a fascinating case study. One of the world's largest transportation companies, and they're really setting a high bar. So their DB 2020 strategy aims to make them a leader in sustainability while still, being economically successful. What's impressive is their commitment to monitoring and reviewing their progress.
They're very thorough. They keep track of key sustainability indicators. They get feedback from stakeholders like customers and employees. And they even publish these really transparent sustainability reports. This lets them make adjustments along the way and always be improving.
That kind of transparency is really commendable. It shows a real commitment. But even with the best intentions, I'm sure there are still hurdles when trying to roll these initiatives out across different countries and cultures.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine creating a marketing campaign that might be okay in one country but ends up being completely offensive in another because of cultural differences. It highlights how important it is to be culturally aware and sensitive in global CSR.
It's a great point. It's not as simple as just creating a global strategy and expecting it to work everywhere, is it?
Not at all. Companies need to understand the cultural nuances of different regions and tailor their approach accordingly. It's about respecting those differences and actually integrating them into the CSR strategy.
So, cultural awareness is key. What other challenges come into play when managing CSR across borders?
One of the biggest ones is the sheer number of stakeholders involved.
You've got governments, NGOs, consumers, investors, everyone wants a say, right?
Exactly. And each stakeholder has their own priorities and opinions. Companies need to carefully consider all these perspectives when developing CSR strategies for different regions.
Makes sense. Balancing those different viewpoints is critical for companies to operate ethically and responsibly in today's world. How does the idea of a global corporate culture, with a shared understanding of social responsibility, mesh with the need to adapt to local contexts? Especially when we compare, say, the US and Europe, how they approach CSR.
That's an interesting comparison. It seems like U.S. companies often focus on philanthropy and boosting their corporate image.
Whereas in Europe, there's more of an emphasis on weaving CSR into the very fabric of the business.
You got it. Europe tends to have stricter regulations and higher stakeholder expectations when it comes to CSR, which definitely plays a role.
So interesting to see how these regional differences influence how companies approach social responsibility. But location aside, it seems like there's a growing need for a broader framework for international ethics and social responsibility in business in general. What are some of the big international laws and organizations that are helping to establish this?
There are quite a few big players working to set ethical standards for businesses worldwide. A prime example is the UN Global Compact. It encourages companies to embrace universal principles in areas like human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption.
That sounds pretty comprehensive. Are there other organizations doing similar work?
Absolutely. The OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has developed guidelines specifically for multinational enterprises. These guidelines provide recommendations on responsible business conduct across a wide range of issues, from employment and human rights to environmental stewardship, anti-corruption, and even consumer protection.
So both the UN Global Compact and the OECD guidelines seem to be shaping how companies approach ethical business practices globally. Any other organizations worth mentioning?
Definitely. There's the International Labor Organization, or ILO, which has established conventions and recommendations concerning workers' rights and labor standards. We also have ISO 26000, an international standard that offers guidance on social responsibility. It covers things like organizational governance, human rights, labor practices, and the environment. And then there's the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, an international organization that's developed standards for sustainability reporting. This lets companies report on their social, environmental, and economic performance in a standardized way.
Wow, it's amazing to see so many organizations dedicated to making global business more ethical and sustainable. Now let's talk about codes of conduct. How do those fit into all of this?
Codes of conduct are essential in the business world. Think of them like blueprints for ethical behavior, ensuring that companies maintain high standards across all their operations. They really reflect a company's values and principles, giving clear guidelines for how employees should behave, regardless of where they are operating.
Can you give us some examples of some well-known codes used in different industries? I'm curious to see how they vary.
Of course. The Business Social Compliance Initiative, or BSCI, is a good one. It's a European code that focuses on working conditions, labor rights, and environmental protection within supply chains.
Especially crucial in industries with complex global supply chains, right? What other codes of conduct are really making a difference out there?
There's the Ethical Trading Initiative, or ETI, based in the UK. They help companies implement ethical trading practices throughout their supply chains. And we can't forget the Fair Labor Association, or FLA, an international code dedicated to improving working conditions in global supply chains as well.
These organizations play a vital role in ensuring fairness and ethical sourcing, especially within these intricate global supply chains. Any others our listeners should know about?
Definitely. There's SA 8000, an internationally recognized standard for social accountability. This one was created by Social Accountability International and outlines criteria for critical issues like child labor, forced labor, health, and safety. And of course, many multinational corporations create their own internal codes of conduct, often reflecting the company's values and principles on a global scale. These apply to everyone, from their employees to their suppliers, promoting ethical behavior throughout the entire organization.
It's inspiring to see so many organizations working toward a more ethical and responsible global business landscape. But with all these different cultures and ethical standards around the world, I imagine making those ethical decisions in a cross-cultural setting can be super tricky.
Yeah, navigating those nuances is crucial. Companies can take a number of steps to make sure they're acting ethically and with cultural sensitivity.
What are some practical steps, things companies can actually do to tackle this?
One great starting point is training on intercultural competence. This helps employees really understand and appreciate different cultures, which is so important in today's globalized workplace.
Especially when you have teams spread across different continents, right?
Yeah.
What other strategies can companies put in place to promote ethical decision-making in those environments?
Having clear ethical guidelines and codes of conduct that emphasize cultural sensitivity and respect is key, and these need to be reviewed and updated regularly to make sure they're relevant in a constantly changing world.
It's like having a framework for ethical conduct, but it's also essential to engage with local stakeholders, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Getting input from local communities, customers, suppliers, and other relevant groups is critical. It's about building those relationships and fostering open dialogue as essential parts of ethical decision-making.
Makes a lot of sense. Speaking of ethical challenges, let's talk about corruption. It's a huge issue in the global business world that can cost companies millions and seriously damage reputations. What can businesses do to combat corruption and foster a more ethical business environment?
Tackling corruption is a top priority. It needs a multifaceted approach with both preventative and reactive measures. A solid foundation starts with clear anti-corruption policies and procedures that apply to every single employee, regardless of their role or location.
That's important. It sets the tone. What else can companies do to minimize those corruption risks?
Regular training for employees is key, especially for those in high-risk positions or regions. This training should help them spot red flags and know what to do if they suspect any corrupt activities. It's also essential to do your due diligence on business partners, suppliers, and third-party intermediaries.
So it's not just about looking inward. It's about making sure that the companies you partner with are also upholding the same ethical standards, right? Are there other strategies companies can employ to mitigate these risks?
For sure. A robust whistleblower program is crucial. It creates a safe, confidential way for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. It empowers individuals to speak up and helps organizations catch and address corruption early on.
Creating a culture of transparency and accountability. Any final thoughts on combating corruption before we move on?
Regularly reviewing and updating anti-corruption policies and procedures is key to make sure they align with current laws and best practices. The fight against corruption is an ongoing one and requires vigilance, adaptability, and a commitment to ethical conduct from everyone in the organization. Interestingly, did you know that according to the Corruption Perception Index, Western European countries, Singapore, and Canada are among the top 10 least corrupt nations?
It's fascinating to see those regional trends. Now, let's shift our focus to multinational corporations, or MNCs, operating in developing countries. What are some key considerations for these companies to ensure they're doing business ethically and responsibly?
This is where things get even more complex. Respecting local cultures and traditions is absolutely crucial. MNCs need to truly understand and appreciate the cultural and social norms of the countries where they operate. They need to recognize and value local customs, understanding that what might be okay in one part of the world could be completely unacceptable in another.
It's all about being mindful and respectful of those cultural differences, right? What else is important for MNCs to consider when working in developing countries?
Ensuring fair labor conditions is vital. That means paying fair wages that align with industry standards and providing safe and healthy working conditions for every employee. MNCs must also respect workers' rights, including their right to freedom of association.
These are fundamental rights that should be upheld everywhere. What about environmental protection?
Another crucial area, especially since environmental regulations in developing countries might not be as strict as in developed nations. MNCs need to maintain high environmental standards and implement sustainable business practices.
So minimizing their environmental footprint, reducing waste, conserving resources, and maybe even exploring renewable energy options.
Exactly. They should strive to be leaders in environmental stewardship, going above and beyond what's required.
It's about being a responsible global citizen. Any other advice for MNCs navigating the complexities of doing business in developing countries?
Two more things. First, tackling corruption is non-negotiable. MNCs need to have clear policies against bribery and corruption and ensure these policies are followed by their own employees, local partners, and contractors alike.
Absolutely crucial, since corruption can have devastating consequences for economic growth and poverty levels. What's your last piece of advice for MNCs working in developing countries?
Transparency is key. MNCs should be open about their business practices and publish regular reports detailing their activities and showing their commitment to ethical conduct. This also means having real conversations with local communities, NGOs, and government agencies to address concerns and make sure their operations are benefiting everyone involved. Building trust through transparency is vital for long-term success and sustainability.
Couldn't agree more. Transparency, fairness, and a deep respect for local cultures are paramount. Let's shift gears and look at some real-world scenarios that illustrate these principles in action. We've got 3 compelling case studies to explore, starting with one that's close to home for many: the pharmaceutical industry.
Let's dive in.
This case involves Pharmacare Inc., an international pharmaceutical company that's about to launch a new drug for a serious illness. They want to launch it in multiple countries, including the US, Germany, and India. The catch is they're under immense pressure to speed up those clinical trials so they can get this potentially life-saving drug to market faster.
It's a classic ethical dilemma, balancing the urgency of getting treatment to those in need with ensuring the drug's safety and effectiveness.
Right. Rushing the trials could jeopardize patient safety and undermine the whole research process. High stakes indeed. So how can Pharmacare Inc. make sure that social responsibility and protecting patients remain their top priorities throughout this process?
A crucial step is to have a strong system of independent ethical reviews for all clinical trials.
So bringing in outside experts and ethics committees to provide that unbiased perspective.
Precisely. These independent bodies can review study protocols, assess the risks and benefits for participants, keep an eye on the trials, and address any ethical concerns that come up. It's all about ensuring that every single step in the drug development process meets the highest ethical and scientific standards.
Transparency seems incredibly important in a situation like this.
Absolutely. Open and honest communication with everyone involved. Patients, healthcare professionals, regulatory agencies, everyone needs to be in the loop.
Building trust and making sure everyone understands the potential risks and benefits of the drug. What about ethical considerations, conflicts of interest, and the role of regulatory bodies in this scenario? How do those all play in?
They're all connected. Ethical considerations should drive every decision made during the drug development process. Conflicts of interest, particularly those involving money, must be identified and managed transparently so that they don't put patient safety or the integrity of the research at risk. And of course, regulatory bodies like the FDA in the US and the European Medicines Agency in Europe are essential in overseeing clinical trials.
They set the standards, they review the data, and ultimately, they decide if a drug is safe and effective enough to be approved.
Exactly. Their main goal is to protect public health.
This case really highlights the huge responsibility pharmaceutical companies have. They need to develop life-saving treatments, but they also have to protect patients and maintain public trust. Let's move on to our next case, which delves into the world of fashion.
This one really shines a light on the social and environmental challenges companies face with their supply chains. We're focusing on Fashion Global Ltd., an international clothing company that sources products from various countries, including Bangladesh, China, and Mexico. They've recently been in the news because of reports of questionable labor practices and environmental concerns coming from factories within their supply chain.
It's a tough spot to be in, but companies can't ignore what's happening in their supply chains anymore.
You're right. The responsibility goes way beyond just designing and marketing products. Fashion Global Ltd. has to take concrete steps to ensure social responsibility and sustainability are embedded in every stage of their supply chain.
Absolutely. They need to acknowledge that their business decisions have real consequences for people and the environment. So, what concrete steps can they take to fix these issues? What can they do to improve working conditions and promote eco-friendly practices within their supply chain?
They need a strong system for monitoring working conditions in their supplier factories. This could involve regular inspections, audits by independent third parties, and even confidential worker surveys to get a clear picture of what's really going on.
So they can identify and address any violations quickly.
Exactly. And it's crucial that Fashion Global Ltd ensures all their suppliers adhere to those fundamental labor standards.
You're talking fair wages, reasonable working hours,
Yeah.
access to health care, safe working conditions, the essentials.
Absolutely. And promoting sustainable practices is key too. This means exploring things like organic cotton or recycled fabrics, using energy-efficient technologies in their factories, and minimizing waste and pollution throughout the entire supply chain.
Working towards a more circular and sustainable fashion industry. Love it. Are there other steps Fashion Global Ltd can take to improve their social and environmental responsibility in their supply chain?
For sure, auditing and certifying their supplier factories would be a big step.
Working with reputable third-party organizations to assess and verify the social and environmental performance of their suppliers.
Exactly. That adds another layer of accountability and gives consumers more transparency. It's also important to provide training and capacity building programs for their suppliers.
Equipping suppliers with the knowledge and resources they need to improve.
You got it. This could involve training on labor rights, workplace safety, environmental management systems, and how to implement sustainable production practices. Finally, Fashion Global Ltd should consider partnering with NGOs and other organizations that specialize in social and environmental issues in the fashion industry.
So collaborating with experts who can provide guidance and support.
Exactly. NGOs can help a lot with guidance on best practices, setting up worker empowerment programs, and navigating the tricky world of ethical sourcing.
This case really shows just how important supply chain transparency and ethical sourcing are these days. Now let's move on to our final case, which explores the ethical considerations in the financial industry. This case focuses on Global Bank International, a bank that's facing the challenge of working with clients from all walks of life, each with their own set of ethical standards. The dilemma comes in when some clients ask for investment products that support industries that are considered ethically controversial, things like fossil fuels or weapons manufacturing.
It's a big ethical dilemma for Global Bank International. They have to balance their clients' investment preferences and the potential for profit with their own ethical principles. Do they put their clients first, or do they uphold their values even if it means losing clients who want to invest in those sectors?
It's about finding that balance between serving their clients and staying true to their own ethical commitments. So how can a bank like Global Bank International navigate this and ensure they're upholding ethical standards and social responsibility in all their financial dealings?
Having clear ethical guidelines and investment strategies that align with their core values and principles is crucial.
So if the bank decides to prohibit or restrict investments in certain sectors for ethical reasons, those decisions need to be communicated clearly and reflected in their investment policies.
You got it. Transparency is key. They need to be open with their clients about the ethical factors driving their investment decisions.
That makes sense. It allows clients to make informed choices that are aligned with their own values as well. So what role do ethical guidelines, client preferences, and regulations play in all of this?
They all work together. Ethical guidelines provide that framework for making responsible investment decisions. Client preferences are important to consider, but they can't override the bank's commitment to ethical conduct. And of course, regulations set boundaries and make sure banks are operating ethically and legally.
It's about striking a balance, navigating those sometimes competing priorities while upholding ethical standards and keeping that public trust.
Exactly. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean Global Bank International has to completely avoid investments in sectors like fossil fuels or defense.
That's interesting. Can you expand on that?
Sure, it's more about being transparent with their clients about their investment practices and the options available. Their investment strategies need to be designed and implemented in a way that aligns with a well-defined code of ethics, one that emphasizes ethical principles and social responsibility.
It's about finding that sweet spot, meeting the needs of their diverse clientele while staying true to their values and commitment to responsible investing. This case really illustrates how businesses in the financial sector can handle those ethical dilemmas, make responsible choices, and contribute to a more sustainable and equitable financial system overall.
Absolutely. These case studies demonstrate that ethical challenges in international business are rarely black and white. It's about navigating those complexities and making decisions that take everyone's needs into account.
taking that holistic approach and realizing that business decisions have far-reaching consequences.
Exactly. Ethics need to be baked into a company's business strategy, not just an afterthought.
Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into international management, ethics, and sustainability, I want to shift gears for a second and talk about intercultural dilemmas that come up in the workplace. We've already touched on the importance of cultural awareness in global business, but I'm curious to explore this further, how ethical values can sometimes clash in these cross-cultural settings.
That's an important point, and something that often doesn't get enough attention. When you have people from all different backgrounds working together, there are bound to be differences in values, beliefs, and communication styles. What one culture might see as ethical could be perceived completely differently by another.
Can you give us a real-life example, something to make this really resonate with our listeners?
Definitely. Imagine a US-based multinational company that has a subsidiary in a country where the culture is much more hierarchical. Seniority and respect for authority are highly valued. Now, let's say an employee at that subsidiary witnesses something they believe is unethical conduct by a senior manager. Their cultural background, which emphasizes respect for authority, might make them hesitant to speak up.
That's a tough situation to be in. It really highlights the importance of having a workplace culture that encourages open communication and ethical behavior, regardless of those cultural differences.
You're absolutely right. It's about bridging cultural gaps and making sure everyone feels safe and empowered to raise concerns, regardless of their position or background. So how can companies actually create this kind of ethical and inclusive workplace culture when they're operating globally? What are some practical things they can do?
Education and training are key.
So giving employees the tools they need to understand those different cultural perspectives and navigate those ethical gray areas.
Exactly. This could involve workshops on things like intercultural communication, conflict resolution, ethical decision-making, and even going through the company's code of conduct in detail. The goal is to build a shared understanding of ethical values and expectations across the entire organization, no matter the cultural differences.
It's about finding that common ground while still respecting and valuing the diversity of thought and perspective.
Exactly. Another crucial thing is making sure employees have safe, confidential ways to report any ethical concerns without fear of retaliation. Think things like an ethics hotline, an ombudsman, or even an online reporting system. Having a safe space to speak up is so critical, especially when you're dealing with sensitive issues like potential misconduct. What other recommendations do you have for fostering ethical decision-making in situations where you've got these different cultures interacting?
Companies should have clear ethical guidelines and codes of conduct that are specifically designed for multicultural work environments. These guidelines need to be translated into all the relevant languages and clearly communicated to everyone, no matter their location or background.
Making sure everyone's on the same page and understands the company's values and expectations for ethical behavior wherever they are in the world. Speaking of guidelines, our conversation today has really highlighted this massive web of international laws, organizations, and initiatives, all pushing for a more ethical and responsible way of doing business globally. It can be a lot to keep track of. Is there a way to simplify this for our listeners? Where should they even start?
That's a great point. It can feel overwhelming. The best approach is to focus on the organizations and initiatives that are most relevant to a company's specific industry and where they do business. So, for example, a company making clothes and sourcing materials from Bangladesh would want to be familiar with the International Labor Organization, ILO, and their conventions on labor standards, as well as things like the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety.
That makes sense. Prioritizing the things that will have the most direct impact on their operations and stakeholders.
Exactly. Another helpful tip is to utilize those online resources and databases that offer information on ethical business practices and the relevant organizations. A good example is the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. They have a ton of information on human rights issues in global supply chains, including country-specific profiles and company rankings.
It sounds like a treasure trove of information for companies that are serious about making improvements in their social and environmental practices.
Absolutely. And don't forget about industry-specific associations that focus on ethical business practices within their sector. The Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, EICC, is a great example for companies in the electronics world.
So many resources out there. It sounds like if a company is willing to do a little research, they can find the information they need. What's the key takeaway you want listeners to walk away with?
The most important thing is just to start somewhere. Don't let the complexity of it all stop you from taking action. Start by identifying those key issues and stakeholders that are most relevant to your business, and then you can gradually build your knowledge and engagement from there. It's a process.
It's about taking that first step and committing to continuous improvement. It's a journey, not a destination.
I like that.
It's a journey that's definitely worth taking, both for the sake of our planet and the long-term success of businesses.
I completely agree.
What are your thoughts on how companies can balance making a profit with their responsibility to society and the environment? Do you think it's actually possible to achieve that triple bottom line where people, planet, and profits all thrive?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that a lot of companies are wrestling with. Personally, I believe it is possible to achieve that balance, but it requires a real shift in how we think about business. We need to move away from that old model where the only focus is on maximizing profits for shareholders.
Yeah, like a more stakeholder-centric approach.
Exactly. Are you talking about recognizing that a company's success is tied to the well-being of its employees, customers, suppliers, the community, and the environment?
Exactly. It's about understanding that businesses have a responsibility to create value for everyone who's impacted by their operations, not just the shareholders. And what's exciting is that there's more and more evidence showing that companies who adopt this stakeholder-centric approach are not only more ethical and sustainable, but they're also more profitable over time.
I love that. It really does seem like doing good and doing well can actually go hand in hand.
They absolutely can. When companies prioritize their stakeholders, they build trust, loyalty, and a strong reputation, all of which lead to greater financial success in the long run. Everyone benefits.
That's a powerful message. Businesses can be a real force for good.
And we can all play a part in making that happen. As consumers, investors, and employees, we have a voice. We can support those businesses that align with our values and hold the others accountable for their social and environmental impact. We have the power to create a world that's more just, equitable, and sustainable for everyone.
It's a collective effort for sure.
What a great note to end on. As you all continue exploring the world of international management, think about how you can make a difference and contribute to a more ethical and sustainable business landscape. What kind of impact do you want to leave on the world?
It's definitely a question worth thinking about.
Every decision we make, every action we take, has the potential to create change. Whether you're a CEO, a manager, an employee, or even a student, we can all advocate for ethical and sustainable practices, support companies doing good work, and hold those who aren't accountable.
Don't underestimate the power of small actions. They can have a big impact.
It all starts with each of us making conscious choices and using our voices to create a better future. Imagine a world where businesses are a force for good, where profit and purpose go hand in hand.
A world worth striving for.
This has been a truly insightful deep dive into international management, ethics, and sustainability. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface, though. There's so much more to uncover.
Always more to learn, but I think we've covered some key takeaways that our listeners can really use.
We've talked about social responsibility, the challenges and rewards of sustainability, and the growing emphasis on ethics in global business.
We've explored how cultural differences impact ethical decision-making, the need for clear guidelines and codes of conduct, and the role those different international organizations play in promoting responsible practices.
And those real-world case studies. They brought everything to life, showing the ethical dilemmas that companies grapple with and the steps they can take to navigate them successfully.
Case studies are so valuable. They make these concepts real and show that this isn't just theory. It's happening in boardrooms and factories around the world.
They really get you thinking. As we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. As you continue navigating the world of international management, think about how you can make a difference.
What impact do you want to have on the world? Something to think about.
We all have the power to create change, whether we're a CEO or a student. We can all advocate for more ethical and sustainable practices, support companies that are doing good, and hold those who aren't accountable for their actions.
Remember, even those small actions can have a big impact over time.
It begins with each of us making conscious choices and using our voices to advocate for a better future, for business and for the planet as a whole, a world where profit and purpose work together.
Yeah, that's something worth striving for.
Thank you again for joining us today for this deep dive into international management, ethics, and sustainability. I hope you found it informative and inspiring.
My pleasure. And to our listeners, remember, the journey toward a more ethical and sustainable future is an ongoing one. Keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep pushing for positive change.
If you want to dig deeper into the things we discussed, check out those links to resources like the UN Global Compact and the OECD guidelines. You can find them in the show notes.
Until next time, keep on diving deep. It really is, and it's a journey worth taking, not just for, the planet, but for the long-term success of businesses, too.
I couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing that every business decision has those ripple effects. They go way beyond just the bottom line.
Absolutely. It's about making ethical considerations a core part of how you do business, not just an afterthought.
Now, before we wrap things up, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about those intercultural dilemmas that can pop up in the workplace. We touched on how important cultural awareness is in global business, but I'd love to dig into this a little deeper. You know how ethical values can clash when you've got different cultures at play.
That's a really important point, and one that often gets overlooked. When you have people from all different backgrounds working together, you're bound to run into differences in values, beliefs, and even how people communicate. What one culture might see as perfectly ethical could be viewed very differently by another.
Can you give me an example, something that really illustrates this for our listeners?
Sure. Let's say you have a US-based multinational company that has a subsidiary in a country with a very hierarchical culture where seniority and respect for authority are really important values. Now, imagine an employee at that subsidiary sees what they believe is unethical conduct by a senior manager. Their cultural background, which emphasizes respect for authority, might make them hesitate to say anything.
That's a tough position to be in. Creating a workplace culture where open communication and ethical behavior are encouraged, regardless of cultural differences, seems so crucial.
Absolutely. It's about finding ways to bridge those cultural gaps and making sure that everyone feels safe and empowered to raise concerns, no matter what their position is or their background.
So how do companies actually create this type of ethical and inclusive workplace culture when they're operating steps they can make?
Education and training are essential.
You mean giving employees the tools and knowledge they need to understand those different cultural perspectives and navigate those ethical gray areas that might pop up?
Exactly. This could involve workshops on intercultural communication, conflict resolution, how to make ethical decisions, and even diving deep into the company's code of conduct. The goal is to create this shared understanding of ethical values and expectations across the entire organization, no matter the cultural background.
It's about finding that common ground, but also acknowledging and respecting that diversity of thought and perspective.
Exactly. And another crucial thing is making sure employees have a safe, confidential way to report ethical concerns without fear of being retaliated against. This could be things like an ethics hotline, an ombudsman, or even an online reporting system where they can submit things anonymously.
That safe space for speaking up is so important, especially when you're dealing with potentially sensitive issues like misconduct. Any other tips for fostering ethical decision-making in cross-cultural settings?
Yeah. Companies should have clear ethical guidelines and codes of conduct that are specifically designed for these multicultural environments. It's not enough to just have a one-size-fits-all approach. These guidelines need to be translated into all the relevant languages and communicated clearly to all employees, no matter where they are or their background.
Making sure everyone's on the same page and understands the company's values and expectations for how they should behave wherever they are in the world. Speaking of guidelines, we've talked about this massive network of international laws, organizations, and initiatives, all pushing for more ethical and responsible business practices around the world. It can be really overwhelming to keep track of it all. Is there a way to simplify this for our listeners? Where should they even begin?
It's definitely a lot to take in. The best approach is to really focus on the organizations and initiatives that are most relevant to a company's industry and the specific places where they do business. So, for example, a company that makes clothes and gets their materials from Bangladesh would want to know about the International Labor Organization, the ILO, and their conventions on labor standards. They'd also want to be aware of things like the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and building safety.
So it's all about prioritizing those things that have the most direct impact on their own operations and stakeholders.
Exactly. Another useful tip is to tap into those online resources and databases that are out there. They offer a ton of information on ethical business practices and the relevant organizations you should know about. One good example is the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. They have a ton of info on human rights issues in global supply chains, including country-specific profiles and even company rankings.
What an incredible resource. Access to that kind of information can be invaluable for companies who are really serious about upping their game when it comes to social and environmental responsibility.
Absolutely. And don't forget about those industry-specific associations that are out there. They focus on promoting ethical business practices within their particular sector. A great example is the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, or the EICC. They're a great resource for companies in the electronics industry.
It sounds like there's no shortage of resources available if companies are willing to do a little digging.
Right.
What's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Just start somewhere. Don't let the complexity of this landscape stop you from taking action. Start by identifying those key issues and stakeholders that are most relevant to your specific business, and then build your knowledge and engagement from there. It's a journey, not a sprint.
It's about taking that first step and making a commitment to continuous improvement. Building a truly ethical and sustainable business doesn't happen overnight. It's an ongoing process.
Well said.
It's a journey worth taking, though, both for the planet and for the long-term success of businesses.
I couldn't agree more. What are your thoughts on how companies can actually balance making money with their social and environmental responsibilities? Do you think it's really possible to achieve that triple bottom line, where people, planet, and profits are all thriving?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
I think it's definitely possible, but it requires a real shift in mindset. We need to move away from that old-school way of thinking where the only focus is squeezing every last bit of profit out for the shareholders.
Right. It's about taking a more holistic, stakeholder-centric approach.
Exactly. Recognizing that a company's success is directly tied to the well-being of its employees, its customers, its suppliers, the community, and the environment. It's about understanding that businesses have a responsibility to create value for everyone who is impacted by their operations, not just those shareholders. And the really exciting thing is there's more and more evidence that companies who take this approach, this stakeholder-centric approach, are not only more ethical and sustainable, but they're also more profitable over the long run.
That's what I love to hear. It really seems like doing the right thing and doing well in business can go hand in hand.
Absolutely. When a company puts its stakeholders first, it builds trust, loyalty, and a positive reputation. Those things all contribute to greater financial success. It's a win-win for everyone.
That's such an important message. It shows that businesses can be a real force for good in the world.
And we can all be a part of that. Whether we're consumers, investors, or employees, we have a voice. We can support businesses that share our values and hold those who aren't doing the right thing accountable for their actions. Together, we can work towards a more just, equitable, and sustainable world for everyone.
It takes all of us working together.
And that's a great place to leave things. As you all continue to explore the world of international management, think about how you can personally contribute to creating a more ethical and sustainable business landscape. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? What impact do you want to make on the world?
It's a question worth pondering.
It really is. Every decision we make, every action we take, has the potential to make a difference, no matter where we are in our careers. We can advocate for ethical and sustainable practices, support companies doing good, and hold those who aren't doing enough accountable. It all starts with each of us.
Never underestimate the power of even small actions. They can have a ripple effect over time.
That's so true. It all begins with us making conscious choices and using our voices to create that better future for the business world and for the planet as a whole. A future where profit and purpose are aligned.
It's a future worth fighting for. A future we can all be a part of building.
Exactly. This has been such an insightful deep dive into international management, ethics, and sustainability. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your expertise. It does feel like we've only scratched the surface, though. There's always so much more to explore.
There is, but I think we've touched on some really important points that our listeners can take away and apply in their own work.
Definitely. We've talked about how important social responsibility is, those challenges and opportunities that come with sustainability, and that growing emphasis on ethical conduct for businesses operating globally.
We've looked at how cultural differences play a role in ethical decision-making, the need for clear guidelines and codes of conduct, and the work that international organizations are doing to promote responsible business practices.
And those real-world case studies. They gave us those concrete examples of ethical dilemmas companies face every day and how they can approach them.
I find those case studies so helpful. They really bring the concepts to life and show that this isn't just theory, it's actually happening out there.
Makes you think, for sure. So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. As you all continue navigating the world of international management, think about how you can contribute to making a difference.
What kind of impact do you want to have on the world? It's a question worth asking yourself.
We all have the power to influence change. We can speak up for more ethical and sustainable practices, support companies who are doing the right things, and hold those who aren't accountable. It doesn't matter if you're a CEO or a student, we can all make a difference.
And don't forget, even small actions can create a ripple effect.
It all starts with each of us making those conscious choices, using our voices to advocate for a better future, one where businesses operate ethically and with the planet in mind, a future where profit and purpose go hand in hand.
That's a future worth working towards.
It really is. Thank you again for joining us for this deep dive into international management, ethics, and sustainability. I hope you found it informative and inspiring.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, remember, this journey toward a more ethical and sustainable future is ongoing. Keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep pushing for positive change.
And if you want to learn more about anything we talked about today, be sure to check out the show notes for links to resources like the UN Global Compact and the OECD guidelines.
Until next time, keep diving deep.